Close your eyes and listen. At first, it is only sound. The distant groan of foghorns drifting across the harbor. The metallic shriek of subway wheels carving tunnels beneath Manhattan's bedrock. The overlapping percussion of millions of footsteps striking pavement in Times Square. Each one urgent. Each one convinced it is late for something essential. The city announces itself not with a single voice, but with a relentless chorus. Then the noise becomes physical. You feel it in your chest before you understand it. Your heartbeat adjusts, subtly at first, then decisively, until it begins to synchronize with the rhythm of the crowd. Breath shortens. Shoulders tighten. The pace of strangers becomes your pace. You are carried forward by an invisible current made of schedules, screens, and expectations. Steel towers rise on every side, their mirrored surfaces multiplying light until direction itself becomes uncertain. Between glass and concrete, you lose the horizon. Between traffic signals and digital billboards, you lose the sky. This is New York, the unofficial capital of the world, a vertical empire of ambition constructed from girders and algorithms. A city so loud, it drowns out the memory of its own birth. It calls itself the city that never sleeps, and indeed, it does not. Office windows glow at 3 a.m. Delivery trucks idle before dawn. Trains run beneath the river of taxis long after midnight. But there is a paradox embedded in that wakefulness. A city that never sleeps rarely dreams, and a city that never dreams can forget what it once was. Here, modernity is not an abstract concept. It is a lived pressure. It presses against the skin like humidity. It hums through electrical lines. It demands constant motion. New York does not merely exist. It accelerates. It reinvents itself in steel and glass so quickly that yesterday's skyline becomes today's nostalgia. Each new layer of development buries another layer of memory. Asphalt seals over soil. Foundations cut through forgotten shorelines. Skyscrapers anchor themselves in rock that once felt only wind and tide. To stand in New York today is to stand at the summit of centuries of accumulation. Economic, architectural, psychological. It is a monument to modernization, to the belief that growth is destiny and expansion is proof of life. Yet beneath every polished lobby and beneath every rumbling train platform lies a quieter truth. This island was not always vertical. It was not always illuminated. It was not always loud. The city overwhelms so completely that it can make its own origins seem improbable. Forest before finance, marshland before markets, silence before sirens. The contradiction defines it. A metropolis that refuses to sleep, yet has almost forgotten how it began. And it is precisely in that forgetting, in the layers of progress stacked so high they obscure the ground itself, that the real story waits. Now, let us do something almost unthinkable. Let us begin to remove the city, not gently but forcefully, as if performing an act of historical excavation with bare hands and iron tools. Peel away the asphalt like a hardened scab. Crack the concrete foundations that bite into the bedrock. Tear steel from stone. Let the glass towers collapse into dust. Strip away sewer lines, subway tunnels, electrical veins. Scrape until the grid dissolves. Scrape until the skyline falls silent. This is not nostalgia, it is demolition. Layer by layer, we erase 4 centuries of certainty. The financial district vanishes. Wall Street dissolves. The harbor sheds its piers and container cranes. The noise recedes. What remains is not emptiness, but exposure. Raw rock ridges rising into daylight for the first time in memory. The smell changes first. No longer hot metal and exhaust, but damp earth newly uncovered. The sharp, resinous scent of sap bleeding from ancient oaks. Salt carried inland by Atlantic wind. Decay and growth intertwined. Wet leaves underfoot. Tidal mud breathing along the shoreline. The air is heavier, slower, unmechanized. It is the year 1660, before the grid, before the contracts, before the markets that would come to define the island's destiny. What stands here is not Manhattan, it is Manahatta. Early records preserve variations of the name, Manahatta, Manahatta, derived from the language of the Lenape people. It is often translated as the island of many hills, and that translation matters, because it reminds us that this land was first understood not as real estate, not as property lines or trade routes, but as geography, as elevation, forest, and tide. The hills are not decorative. They shape the wind. They gather rain. They determine where one can see the river and where one disappears into woodland shadow. Streams cut through the terrain toward marshes thick with reeds. Oyster beds cluster along a shoreline unfortified by stone. Hawks circle above clearings where controlled fires once opened space for planting. Before it became the symbolic heart of global capitalism, this island was sacred ground, not in the abstract sense of myth, but in the lived sense of belonging. The Lenape did not own Manahatta in the European legal meaning of the word. They inhabited it, moved with its seasons, named its ridges and coves with intimacy. Land was relationship, not commodity. To reverse time this far is to confront a difficult truth. Civilization, as we recognize it, must be undone before this landscape can reappear. The city cannot coexist with this memory. One must be stripped away for the other to breathe. Stand here now in 1660, and the silence is not absence but fullness. Wind through oak canopies, water against rock, insects rising from tall grasses. No skyline interrupts the horizon. No harbor bristles with masts yet. The island's contours dominate the eye. Not vertical ambition, but uneven earth. The irony is profound. The ground that will one day anchor banks, stock exchanges, and skyscrapers is at this moment defined by hills and forest. The island of many hills will, in time, be leveled, reshaped, and engineered to serve commerce. But in 1660, it still resists that destiny. To understand what New York becomes, we must first feel what Manahatta was, not an emerging financial capital, but a living landscape with its own rhythms, its own sacred geometry, its own meaning long before ledgers and contracts arrived by ship. In the mid-17th century, the center of gravity on Manhattan was not a cathedral or a royal palace. It was a fort, and more precisely, an office. Fort Amsterdam did not function primarily as a bastion of imperial glory. It operated as a headquarters. If you were to strip away the timber palisades and earthen walls, what you would find conceptually resembles the modern campus of a multinational corporation. Centralized decision-making, warehousing, accounting rooms, correspondence desks, and a constant flow of goods in and out. The fort was less a medieval stronghold than an early corporate nerve center. Above it stood the authority of the Dutch West India Company, a chartered enterprise with shareholders, quarterly expectations, and a mandate not to save souls or expand a monarch's divine dominion, but to generate profit. Manhattan was not founded as a sacred outpost of Christendom or as a jewel in a king's crown. It was an investment. This distinction matters. In Spanish colonies, Conquest marched under the banner of both cross and crown. In French territories, royal authority and missionary zeal intertwined. The legitimacy of those settlements derived from monarchy and church, from transcendence and throne. Manhattan, by contrast, emerged from a ledger. Its organizing principle was not theological uniformity or aristocratic hierarchy, but commercial viability. The colony that would become New York began as a balance sheet with a shoreline, and this gave it a strangely modern quality from the start. It tolerated difference not from philosophical enlightenment, but from economic pragmatism. Merchants of various languages, traders of multiple faiths, free and unfree laborers, they were admitted, not because diversity was celebrated, but because trade required flexibility. A rigid orthodoxy is bad for business. So is a closed port. And yet, within this fluid marketplace, stood a man who craved order. Peter Stuyvesant arrived in 1647 as Director General of New Netherland, carrying himself less like a CEO and more like a magistrate of moral discipline. He idealized hierarchy, obedience, and doctrinal clarity. He believed in structure, visible, enforceable, uncompromising. His wooden leg, lost in battle, reinforced his aura of stern resilience. He imagined a well-governed colony, orderly streets, regulated worship, disciplined citizens. But the city beneath him pulsed with mercantile chaos. His ships docked with cargo from the Caribbean. Fur traders negotiated with indigenous partners. Tavern keepers extended credit. Smugglers bent company rules. Languages overlapped in the streets. Contracts were improvised as often as they were honored. Manhattan was not a tidy provincial town. It was an experiment in high-risk commerce at the edge of empire. Stuyvesant tried to impose vertical authority onto a horizontal marketplace. He resisted religious pluralism, not yet economic necessity undermined his rigidity. He sought centralized control, yet the very logic of a trading colony dispersed power among merchants and stakeholders. He governed in the name of order, but the system that employed him rewarded transaction over tradition. Here lies the paradox at the city's origin. Its chief administrator longed for moral coherence, while the enterprise that sustained him thrived on negotiation and flux. And the tension between these forces, discipline and dynamism, hierarchy and hustle, would become structural. Manhattan was not born from divine right or dynastic ambition. It was assembled from contracts, credit, and calculated risk. Its founding document was not a royal decree. It was a charter. Its sacred object was not a relic. It was a ledger. New York did not emerge from monarchy. It emerged from accounting. And that origin story matters, because cities tend to retain the logic of their birth. Where other colonial capitals inherited ceremony, Manhattan inherited velocity. Where others were shaped by cathedral spires and royal plazas, this settlement was organized around docks, warehouses, and profit margins. From the beginning, the island's most powerful structure was not symbolic. It was operational. The fort was the boardroom. The harbor was the marketplace. And the future city grew not as a kingdom extended, but as a startup scaled. At the southern tip of Manhattan, just beyond the walls of Fort Amsterdam, a clearing opened into what would become Bowling Green. It was not grand. It was not paved in marble or framed by triumphal arches. It was a modest patch of open ground, packed earth, uneven grass, the occasional wandering animal. And yet, in its very ordinariness, it performed a revolutionary function. This was public space, not public in the ceremonial European sense, where plazas existed to magnify monarchy or stage religious spectacle, not a square designed for parades of imperial authority. Bowling Green functioned differently. It was not built to display power. It was where power was negotiated. On a given morning, a farmer might lead a small group of cattle across the clearing, arguing loudly over price with a butcher whose hands still smelled of salt and brine. Nearby, a woman with a basket balanced against her hip exchanged news she had gathered from the docks. Which ship had arrived from Curaçao, whose cargo had been delayed, who was rumored to be in debt. A child darted across the grass, chasing another between the boots of merchants and the hems of skirts, barely aware that the adults around him were shaping the colony's future with every handshake and dispute. There was no stage, no throne, no pulpit commanding silence. Instead, there was talk. Merchants debated tariffs, traders negotiated fur contracts, company officials delivered notices from the Dutch West India Company. Settlers complained about taxes or petitioned for rights. Disagreements did not unfold in hushed chambers, but in audible, physical proximity. Voices overlapped. Languages mixed. Dutch, English, French, African dialects, indigenous tongues. Meaning had to be worked out in real time. Here, the fate of the colony was not dictated solely from above. It was bargained into existence. That distinction is subtle, but profound. In many European colonies, decisions flowed downward from crown-appointed governors or ecclesiastical authorities. In this clearing, however, authority was constantly exposed to friction. A regulation could be announced, but its enforcement depended on cooperation. A price could be declared, but its acceptance required consent. Even resistance took the form of negotiation, delay, refusal, counteroffer. Bowling Green became the colony's informal exchange floor, social, political, and economic at once. If Fort Amsterdam resembled a corporate headquarters, this space resembled its trading floor and town hall combined. Contracts were not only written, they were argued. Policies were not only imposed, they were contested. Reputation circulated as currency. Trust accumulated or dissolved in public view. In that sense, Bowling Green operated as a prototype. Not yet a democratic square in the constitutional sense, but something structurally similar. It habituated its participants to the idea that power could be discussed face to face, that authority might be petitioned, that outcomes could hinge on persuasion rather than decree alone. The scene was messy. Mud clung to boots. Livestock disrupted conversations. Children interrupted solemn exchanges. But this messiness was not incidental. It was formative. It trained the colony in a culture of negotiation, and negotiation would become a defining trait of the city that followed. Long before legislative chambers and formal assemblies, there was this clearing where human proximity made abstraction impossible. Debt had a face. Policy had a voice. Authority could be questioned within earshot. The colony's trajectory bent not only because of directives from Amsterdam or London, but because of arguments conducted in open air. Bowling Green did not look like the birthplace of a political tradition. Yet in its daily choreography, cattle traded, rumors exchanged, disputes aired, children weaving through it all, it rehearsed a new civic habit. That public space belongs not merely to rulers, but to participants. And from that habit would grow a distinctly American intuition that the square, however modest, is where society negotiates itself into being. Along the curve of the East River, not far from the docks where ships unloaded sugar, timber, and rumor, Pearl Street emerged as one of the most refined residential enclaves in the young colony. From the water, the houses appeared improbably solid, brick facades rising with European confidence against a landscape that was, only a short walk away, still dense with forest. Behind these homes, the land quickly dissolved into uneven ground, thickets, and the lingering presence of wilderness. Wolves could still be heard beyond the cleared fields. Indigenous trails cut through woods that had not yet been surveyed into orderly grids. Nature pressed close. Yet inside these houses, another world had already assembled itself. Step across the threshold, and boots caked with colonial mud met woven Persian carpets imported at staggering cost. Walls were lined with Delft tiles shipped from the Netherlands. Two cabinets displayed porcelain that had traveled from China through vast maritime circuits of exchange. Silverware bore European crests. Windows, glazed with imported glass, filtered light onto polished wooden tables where merchants reviewed ledgers inked with figures drawn from 3 continents. The contrast was not subtle. It was architectural defiance. On one side of the wall, a continent still being mapped by Europeans, its interior vast and uncertain. On the other, curated luxury assembled from the far edges of global trade. Pearl Street did not merely house wealth. It staged it, deliberately, conspicuously, as proof that this precarious settlement was already plugged into a planetary system. Its bricks themselves carried geography. Many were ballast from ships arriving from the Dutch Republic, repurposed into foundations that made the houses feel as permanent as Amsterdam townhomes. The porcelain in display cabinets testified to trade networks reaching across the Indian Ocean and around the Cape of Good Hope. The furs that financed much of this elegance came from deep within North America's interior, trapped by indigenous hunters, exchanged along river systems, funneled through Manhattan's port, and then shipped onward to European markets. Every object in these homes was a coordinate on a global map. The elite families of Pearl Street understood this, and even if they did not articulate it in modern terms, their status depended not on proximity to a royal court, but on their position within supply chains. They were not aristocrats by blood. They were aristocrats by circulation, masters of flow, goods, credit, information. And yet the wilderness remained just beyond their rear gardens. It is this tension that defined Pearl Street's psychological atmosphere. At dinner, candles flickered over Chinese porcelain, while beyond the shuttered windows, the sounds of wind through untamed trees reminded inhabitants how thin their veneer of control truly was. Civilization here was not ancient or unquestioned. It was assembled, recently, deliberately, and with constant reinforcement from abroad. Luxury in this setting was not merely comfort, it was assertion. To lay a Persian carpet over colonial floorboards was to declare that Manhattan was not peripheral. To sip from imported china was to insist that this outpost belonged to the same commercial universe as Amsterdam, Batavia, or Canton. The wilderness outside did not negate refinement within. It intensified it. The sharper the contrast, the more meaningful the display. In this sense, Pearl Street became something unprecedented, an early symbol of globalization. Not globalization as an abstract economic theory, but as lived domestic reality. A single household contained materials, labor, and value chains spanning Europe, Asia, Africa, and North America. The room itself became a microcosm of interdependence. The colony was still fragile. Political authority could change hands. Alliances could fracture. Crops could fail. But on Pearl Street, a different kind of stability was being constructed. One rooted not in monarchy or military might, but in networked exchange. If Bowling Green modeled negotiation and Fort Amsterdam modeled corporate governance, Pearl Street modeled global integration. It demonstrated quietly but unmistakably that Manhattan's future would not be defined by its forests or even its fortifications, but by its capacity to connect distant worlds and compress them into a single street. In those brick houses between river and wilderness, the first architecture of global capitalism was not debated. It was furnished. Stone Street is narrow, uneven, and loud. Its cobblestones, among the first in the colony, are slick from rain and beer. Wooden houses lean toward one another, as if sharing secrets. Trade spills into the street. Barrels rolled from warehouses, crates pried open, sailors shouting in half a dozen languages, and at the heart of it all are the taverns. They are more than drinking houses. They are informal exchanges, hiring halls, rumor mills, negotiation chambers. Inside, candlelight flickers against low ceilings blackened by smoke. Tankards slam against rough tables. Deals are whispered before they are written. On Stone Street, profit and personality mix freely. It is here that one of the most defining tensions of the colony quietly unfolds. In 1654, a small group of Jewish refugees arrives in New Amsterdam after fleeing persecution in Portuguese-controlled Brazil. Their ship enters the harbor not triumphantly, but cautiously. They carry little: worn trunks, religious texts, uncertainty. When they step down from the vessel onto the dock, there is a moment of stillness. Conversations pause. Eyes linger. The air tightens almost imperceptibly. They are different in faith, in custom, in language. And in a fragile colony already anxious about resources and order, difference can feel like threat. Peter Stuyvesant does not greet their arrival with warmth. Personally, he opposes their settlement. His letters reveal discomfort, even hostility. He worries about religious uniformity, social cohesion, and moral authority. In his view, too much diversity risks disorder. Yet he does not rule alone. The Dutch West India Company intervenes from Amsterdam. Their message is clear. The Jews must be allowed to remain, provided they do not become a financial burden. They are merchants. They bring capital, networks, trade potential. Expelling them would be economically irrational, and so Stuyvesant stands at a crossroads between personal conviction and corporate directive. Inside the taverns of Stone Street, the tension becomes tangible. Merchants discuss the newcomers not in theological terms, but in commercial ones. Can they trade? Do they have contacts in the Caribbean? Will they invest? The conversation is not framed by compassion. It is framed by opportunity. The paradox crystallizes. Tolerance here is not born from kindness. It is born from calculation. See, New Amsterdam is too small, too economically vulnerable to reject useful people. Its survival depends on attracting skills, capital, and connections. Religious purity is less valuable than profitable partnership. This is not an idealistic embrace of pluralism. It is pragmatic inclusion. Stuyvesant, stern and rigid, must yield, not because his heart changes, but because the ledger demands it. The company's priorities override his prejudice. Commerce moderates ideology. And so the Jewish refugees remain. They establish businesses. They participate in trade. Over time, they weave themselves into the economic fabric of the settlement. Their presence does not dissolve difference, but it normalizes coexistence. On Stone Street, where sailors curse in Dutch, English, French, and Scandinavian dialects, diversity is no longer theoretical. It is audible. It is transactional. A Lutheran negotiates with a Calvinist. A Jew extends credit to a trader who may not share his faith. A French Huguenot signs a contract beside a Dutch burgher. No one asks first about doctrine. They ask about reliability. The tavern tables become laboratories of coexistence. It is messy. It is imperfect. Prejudice does not disappear, but it is constrained by mutual dependence. Profit requires partnership. Partnership requires tolerance, however reluctant. In this tension lies something profound. See, what begins as a reluctant concession evolves into a defining trait. The colony learns, almost accidentally, that diversity can be managed, even leveraged. That difference, when channeled through commerce, can strengthen rather than fracture. This moment, quiet, practical, almost uncelebrated, becomes part of the city's genetic code. New York's identity will later be celebrated as cosmopolitan, open, pluralistic. But its earliest form of tolerance was neither sentimental nor philosophical. It was strategic. Stone Street, with its taverns thick with smoke and negotiation, witnesses the birth of a principle that will echo for centuries. In this place you may belong, not because you are the same, but because you are useful. And from that unsentimental beginning, the DNA of New York begins to form. A city where diversity is not merely endured, but integrated into the machinery of ambition. If you walk north from the harbor in 1660, away from the defensive walls and the crowded taverns, you begin to see another kind of ambition at work. Quieter, less dramatic, but no less decisive. There are no grand cathedrals rising toward heaven, no marble palaces declaring eternal glory. Instead, there are canals. Narrow waterways cut deliberately through the settlement, engineered not for beauty but for movement. They redirect marsh water, drain swampy ground, and allow small boats to carry goods deeper into the growing town. Mud is managed, land is reclaimed, flow is controlled. These canals function like arteries, carrying the lifeblood of the colony. Through them move barrels of flour, planks of timber, salted meat, and most importantly, beaver pelts. Every crate that glides across the water represents potential profit. Every controlled current is an investment in efficiency. Without these channels, goods stall. And when goods stall, money stalls. The Dutch did not build them to impress visitors. They built them to reduce friction. Beside the canals rise windmills, practical, angular, unadorned. Their blades turn steadily against the Atlantic wind. They grind grain, saw timber, and power small industries essential to daily life. The wind is not romanticized. It is harnessed. Together, canals and windmills form a system, a network, a coordinated attempt to tame geography in service of trade. This choice is revealing. Other civilizations announce themselves through monuments, cathedrals that aspire to eternity, palaces designed to inspire awe, triumphal arches commemorating conquest. Architecture becomes theology carved in stone. But here in New Amsterdam, architecture becomes accounting. The colony invests in warehouses before sanctuaries, storage before symbolism, dock space before decorative squares. Buildings are measured by capacity. How much can they hold? How quickly can they turn inventory? How efficiently can they load a ship? It raises a provocative question. What kind of civilization chooses warehouses over cathedrals? The answer is not that it lacks faith, nor that it lacks imagination. It is that its faith is placed elsewhere. New Amsterdam is a civilization organized around circulation, of goods, of capital, of information. Its pride lies not in vertical towers reaching toward God, but in horizontal systems accelerating exchange. The sacred space is not the altar, it is the ledger. Even the layout of the town reflects this priority. Streets bend to accommodate docks. Buildings cluster near transport routes. Infrastructure determines social gravity. Where goods move, people gather. Where people gather, decisions follow. Profit requires predictability. Predictability requires systems. Systems require infrastructure. Thus, the canals become more than drainage solutions. They symbolize a worldview. Nature exists to be managed. Space exists to be optimized. Time exists to be saved. The windmills turning above the settlement embody the same logic. They translate invisible force into measurable output. Nothing is wasted. Every gust is an opportunity. In this sense, the foundations of New York are not ornamental. They are logistical. The colony does not define greatness as permanence in stone. It defines greatness as speed, access, scalability. It asks not, how long will this monument stand? But how quickly can this shipment move? This mindset will echo forward for centuries. The modern skyline of New York will later dazzle the world with steel and glass. But long before skyscrapers, the deeper pattern was set. This is a place that worships movement, a place that believes infrastructure is destiny, a place that understands that control over flow, of water, of wind, of goods, is control over power. New Amsterdam may appear modest in 1660. Its buildings are small, its population limited, its resources constrained. But beneath that modest surface lies an organizing principle that will define the future city. New York is not merely a cultural capital. It is a civilization of logistics. New Amsterdam in 1660 likes to imagine itself as practical, tolerant, forward-looking. It negotiates, it trades, it calculates. It prides itself on efficiency and opportunity. But beneath that narrative of commerce and compromise lies another reality, quieter, harsher, and morally unsettling. North of the main settlement, beyond the busier streets and warehouses, the land opens into rough farmland and forest. There, under a wide and indifferent sky, an enslaved African man bends over a plow. The soil is heavy. Each step forward requires force. The wooden blade cuts through earth that will not belong to him. Sweat darkens his shirt. His labor feeds a colony that denies him full personhood. He works land owned by the Dutch West India Company, the same company that speaks the language of contracts and markets, that calculates risk and return with precision. For the company, enslaved labor is another asset category, another line in the ledger. Yet the man holding the plow is not an abstraction. He has a name, a memory of another shore, perhaps a family torn apart by sail. He hears the wind move through trees that are not native to his childhood. He knows that his strength sustains a settlement that calls itself modern. New Amsterdam does not practice slavery as a peripheral institution. It integrates it into its infrastructure. Enslaved Africans clear land, build roads, construct fortifications, unload ships. They help raise the very systems, canals, warehouses, defensive works, that define the colony's efficiency. There is a cruel irony here. A society that prizes trade, negotiation, and calculated tolerance simultaneously sustains a system that denies negotiation to some of its own inhabitants. The Dutch sometimes grant what they call half-freedom to certain enslaved individuals. On paper, it appears progressive. Limited rights to farm small plots of land, the ability to earn wages, conditional family stability. But half-freedom is not freedom. It is conditional liberty, revocable, restricted, incomplete. It acknowledges humanity just enough to extract more productivity. It is a compromise between conscience and profit. The enslaved man in the northern fields may one day qualify for such status. He may be allowed to cultivate a small parcel for himself while still owing labor to the company. He may taste autonomy in fragments, yet his life remains bounded by ownership. This is the paradox at the heart of the colony. A place experimenting with pluralism while simultaneously institutionalizing bondage. A settlement negotiating religious coexistence while enforcing racial hierarchy. And then there is the wall. Along the northern boundary of the settlement, Dutch authorities erect a defensive barrier, a rough wooden wall reinforced with earth. Officially, it is built to protect against potential attacks, from indigenous groups resisting encroachment, from English forces eyeing expansion. The wall is born of fear of invasion, fear of loss, fear of instability in a fragile outpost of empire. It marks a line between inside and outside, between those considered protected and those considered threat. It materializes anxiety into timber and soil. Over time, the path that runs along this barrier becomes known as Wall Street. Today, the name evokes finance, capital markets, global influence. But its origin is not in banking halls or trading floors. It begins in division. A wall erected not to facilitate exchange, but to prevent it. The irony deepens with history. The physical barrier will disappear, dismantled as the colony expands and changes hands. But the space it once occupied transforms into a hub of commerce. Financial institutions cluster where fortification once stood. What began as a structure of defense evolves into a symbol of capital, yet the foundation is telling. Wall Street does not originate from prosperity, it originates from insecurity, from the recognition that wealth attracts danger, that openness requires protection, that ambition breeds anxiety. The enslaved man in the northern field and the wooden wall on the colony's edge are not separate stories. They are connected expressions of the same logic. Control. Control over land. Control over labor. Control over borders. New Amsterdam's promise of opportunity is real, but unevenly distributed. Its tolerance is strategic, but selective. Its infrastructure is efficient, but built partly on coerced work. To understand the birth of New York is to hold both truths at once. It is a city shaped by trade and negotiation, and it is a city shaped by fear and exploitation. Wall Street, now synonymous with finance, begins not with money, but with a line drawn in the dirt, a declaration that some belong inside and others must remain out. In that tension, between freedom and constraint, openness and exclusion, the darker strands of New York's DNA are formed alongside its celebrated ambition. In 1664, the English ships appear in the harbor with quiet confidence. They do not arrive in chaos. They arrive with calculation. Their cannons are visible but not yet fired. Their message is direct. Surrender New Amsterdam to the English crown. Resistance will mean bombardment. Compliance will mean protection of property and continuation of trade. Inside Fort Amsterdam, tension tightens like a drawn wire. Peter Stuyvesant wants to fight. For him, surrender is humiliation. He is a soldier. He has lost a leg in battle. Honor, loyalty, and authority are not abstract ideas. They are personal commitments. To yield without resistance feels like betrayal of the Dutch Republic, of the company, of himself. He reportedly tears up the English demand for surrender. But outside the fort, another force is gathering. Not military, but commercial. The merchants of New Amsterdam are watching the harbor as well. they calculate differently. They know the colony's defenses are weak. The fortifications are modest. Supplies are limited. Reinforcements from the Netherlands are uncertain. A battle would not be a glorious stand. It would be destruction. Warehouses burned, ships sunk, inventory lost. For them, the question is not pride. It is continuity. If the English promise to respect existing property rights, allow freedom of trade, and maintain civil order, then what exactly would war accomplish? What would victory change that contract cannot preserve? A group of prominent burghers drafts a petition urging surrender. They pressure Stuyvesant directly. They refuse to let him drag the town into a symbolic war. They understand something fundamental. This settlement is not a fortress of ideology. It is a network of contracts. Economic logic begins to outweigh military ego. The turning point is not marked by a cannon blast, but by persuasion. Stuyvesant stands at a crossroads between two models of power. One is martial, authority defended through force, territory held by the sword. The other is commercial, authority preserved through negotiation, assets protected through agreement. Rome built its empire on legions and conquest. Territory was secured through domination, loyalty enforced by fear and discipline. The sword established order. New Amsterdam represents a different experiment. Its foundation was trade. Its infrastructure served logistics. Its tolerance emerged from profit. Now, and at the moment of existential threat, it chooses again according to that logic. The merchants are not cowards. They are consistent. They recognize that empire can change flags without destroying value if contracts survive. Sovereignty may shift, but property, networks, and commercial habits can endure. And so the colony surrenders. There is no heroic last stand, no dramatic final battle. The Dutch flag is lowered. The English flag rises. New Amsterdam becomes New York. The transformation is political, but the deeper structure remains intact. Trade continues. Ships still enter the harbor. Warehouses still store goods. The street, once bordered by a defensive wall, will eventually become a financial artery under English rule. The logic of the place proves stronger than the nationality of its rulers. This is the philosophical core of the moment. New York survives because it chooses contract over combat. It chooses the preservation of exchange over the performance of pride. In doing so, it signals the kind of civilization it will become. Empires built solely on military glory often collapse when force weakens. Empires built on commerce adapt. They negotiate, they rebrand. They integrate new rulers into existing systems. New York's identity is not rooted in a single flag. It is rooted in function. The decision to surrender is not merely an act of pragmatism. It is a declaration of values: prosperity over symbolism, continuity over spectacle, negotiation over annihilation. What might have been remembered as a defeat becomes, in retrospect, a foundation. Because the city that emerges does not depend on who governs it, but on how it operates. Rome expanded through conquest. New York expands through contracts. One model draws boundaries with armies, the other redraws them with agreements. From that moment in 1664, the DNA of the future city becomes unmistakable. It will fight when necessary, but it will always prefer the deal. It will change rulers, languages, and demographics, but it will protect circulation of capital, of ideas, of ambition. New York does not endure because it never lost. It endures because it understood that survival sometimes requires surrender, and that the marketplace can outlast the battlefield.